excited about this topic today. Talk less, smile more. I'm just gonna say Sandy brought this up because, Hamilton has been in the forefront of our thoughts this summer with it going to Disney Plus. Plus, you were reading it, right,
Right.
Sandy?
Yeah.
And I love the music of Hamilton, and we got to see it up in Chicago. So I was like, "Ooh, I love this!" But talk less, smile more. So tell me about this, Sandy. How you came up with this?
Okay. So, yes, I read the book, which we've talked about in past podcasts, and Amy had seen it, in person, uh, and that great venue. And then I was excited too with Disney Plus coming out. Amy and another had given me great advice to tell me to listen to the soundtrack closely first. And I really did. And his soundtrack is so clever and good. And so I did the repeat, 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 and the song and then watching the play when Aaron Burr told Hamilton, talk less, smile more. That's some real sound advice I had been giving over the years because I tend to be a blurter. There was parts of Hamilton, like, oh, and telling everybody what he was thinking that reminded me of myself. And so I found myself, if I went on a Zoom meeting, just to remind myself, I would write down on the bottom of my paper, talk less, smile more. And it would actually make me smile because they'd be singing in my ear and I would sit and, it would be a really good exercise for me to sit back, take some notes, let others talk first. And it always made the outcome of the meeting better. So back to, we were always thinking of different clever little topics or titles that get us talking and get the conversation going. And when we put this out to the poll, there were a lot of people that responded to this topic and said, oh, that's something we'd like for you guys to talk about. But Amy, the interesting part was, in my mind, so here's the interesting part, is 100% without hesitation, the title, the song, the message to me was it's always better for people to let other people talk first. That it was really a message to me, a person who likes to be heard, to listen before talking. And I thought through all the different good advice I've been given over the years on that. And then when I brought it up to Amy, she read it completely differently. She saw it at first blush. And Amy, you tell me, I gave my whole first blush of what that sentence meant to me. What did that sentence mean to you?
Right. And I completely agreed with everything that you said, but then I was like, but the smile more makes me pause because as a female working in a male culture, I typically got to be the person that heard, you need to smile more. If I was in a meeting and being serious, and I remember thinking, why aren't they looking at any of the men in this meeting and telling them to smile more? So, it was this perception of this young professional, and and I will say I haven't gotten that comment lately, but I know that's like a thing. Um, why are why is there this expectation that women should be bubbly and happy and it's okay for men to be serious. So anyway, that was kind of my like, I agree with the talk less.
Right.
I'm a little bit like smile more, and I totally love Hamilton. But yes, that was my take.
You know what? You just gave me a flashback back to focusing more on the smile more. I remember, and again, I'm going to go back to your point, Amy. I haven't heard it for a while, but I remember in my college or young adult age a few different times in a work setting or in a social setting, having a man come up to me and say, you don't look happy. You need to smile more. What are you not happy right now? And it's like, what the shit? You know, why? I remember one specific, it was more of a social setting that he kept saying, you just don't look happy and you're not smiling. And I'm like, first of all, the reality is I really didn't want to be there. I was trying to pass time. But how many men go to things and they don't really want to be there? And I wasn't frowning, I
Right,
just wasn't smiling. And he made
right.
this big deal about, I'm going to make you smile. And how do I get you to smile? And I thought, oh my good Lord, stop. And
Why is that so
why
important?
is that so important? And I'd be curious, question I'd have for your daughters, do they ever hear things like that anymore? Have you ever heard them say that they've been asked a question like, smile more, aren't you happy, lighten up?
You know
Or
what?
was
I'm
that
gonna
an era
put
thing?
that question to them because they haven't mentioned it. I should have asked them before we recorded because that would have been some good insights to hear
And
about.
there's nothing worse, honestly, Amy, than when somebody coming up to you and saying you need to smile, because that's called fake. Talk about real. Why don't you smile more? That's an expression of happiness. That's an expression. Should you be forced to smile? Um, Now, I would say,
I
like,
was gonna say no.
no,
No, you shouldn't be forced to smile. You should, and people shouldn't feel like they need to that me not smiling means that they need to change that.
right.
Like, you know what I mean? Like people look around and say, "Oh, who's unhappy here?" And do I need to make them smile? Instead of just trying to connect and see what's going on, and just trying, I don't know, just
Being a
trying to get people to,
there's a definite sexist thing about being a pretty face at the table, and you're much more appealing to them if you smile. It's a very
right.
sexist remark. Now,
Yes.
the intent, and I'm actually I found this great, just a short little article that came up when I was doing a little research once you brought up your point, thinking, was I the only one who, did Lin-Manuel really have a backwards, he has a really funny sense of humor. Was I reading into this wrong? And I found a great analysis from a communication artist. But I think the intent was, when you say smile more, it's more the lighten up. So in his situation, it was, don't be so serious, lighten up a little bit. There was different connotations about it. But what's funny is, so I'm going to tell you a few things that she said in here. Her very first, in her blog post, it's called Talk Less, Smile More. Very beginning, if you, like me, have been captivated by the music of Hamilton, I'm sure you've been struck by the genius of his lyrics. But when I first heard the talk less, smile more, my initial reaction was, as any woman hearing this lyric did, that we have heard this so many times, and that this was a comment made basically toward women. And she saw it too as, so the second part is, of her knee jerk was exactly what you thought, Amy, that was a comment made toward women. But then she felt that Hamilton was being objectified by somebody from a privileged class. So very similar, man to woman, is
Interesting.
Aaron Burr was basically saying, you just need to smile more and talk less.
Right. Let's be a little classier here.
Let's
And
be a little classier. And it was a little bit more than just friendly advice. It was more, because it can have a degrading connotation to it. But then Lin-Manuel brought it back, Miranda brought it back so much better, because then he was offered the same advice by Washington, and it came from a pure motive to help him out. And he needed to master the skill of listening, which was what I initially heard from the very beginning. And because of that, back to she said, I'm not entirely sure what Alexander Hamilton learned from this message, but as a communications coach, I believe there are many times situations where talking less helps us make essential connections of community. And her big thing, and I really like this, is you can't connect with people if they feel they're being talked at. You have to speak to them. And so if you're talking at them rather than speaking to them, and talking at them means you don't give them time to breathe, that you don't
right,
care. Speaking to them is engaging in, back to how many different things we talked about, a two-way conversation. When we
right,
talked about when to say or when to know, if the other person doesn't care about what your opinion is, that's being talked at. That's not speaking to. That's not saying, okay, what do you think?
and
And
and to that point, if you're really super passionate about something, sometimes it's hard to talk to people about it because you'll have this energy and this excitement and this passion, and sometimes you don't take the time to, which was what was going on with Hamilton, right? Like he was so passionate that he just was talking at people and he was putting himself out there and Burr was like, just calm it down a little.
Right.
And so that you can
Motive
talk
is pure.
to people. Yeah.
Two people, and that's the mistake that I find myself getting into. And I see when I, and the opposite, when I'm being talked at, then I'm making notes or I'm waiting to say my side because I'm really not listening to them because you know that you're being talked at. It's, think about it like with our kids. Let's use that rather than a work. So if they're being talked at, they're just waiting to say their piece or walk away. It's one of two things. They're kind of going through, should I say or should I know? They're either going to shut down or they're going to wait to say their piece, and they're really not listening to what you have to say because you're talking at them.
Right.
And and I think there are a lot of people that my motive is typically pure. Okay. I'm not saying it always is because sometimes I just want to be heard, right? But
As do all of us, just so you know. Like,
but I want to, I've been, other advice that I've been given over the years. I had a lawyer that was a really good mentor of mine that said, do the 5-second rule. Take a sip of your coffee, count to 10 before you say something. Just always do that and let somebody else talk, because it was my natural inclination to want to jump out there and put my 2 cents in. And it wasn't because, it's because I had come to some conclusion that I was excited about. That's typically something I want to share, my aha moment. I got to a point that I wanted to get everybody else up to where I'm at. Um, but the other side to that isn't, part of that's understanding your human makeup. I've got, my number one in strengths is strategic. Okay. So what that means is I am constantly, if there's 10 points, 1 through 10, I am getting to point 10 and thinking of alternatives on how to get to 10 successfully. And then I work my way back to the strategy. And I usually have 4 different paths. Well, it comes across as monkeys in my head because, and people will say, oh, she's really resourceful, she's a good problem solver, or they lean on me to fix situations because I'm always looking ahead and coming up with the solutions. But here's the problem with that. My husband's a linear thinker. A lot of people need to go through the steps. I haven't bought them into how I got to that place. And so then I'm talking at them because I'm telling them what we need to do rather than taking them on the journey of getting there. And
right.
so that, sometimes even if I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I'm already there, I already figured out this isn't going to work, this is going to work, I've come to a conclusion, and ultimately I've got the final say because I'm the decision maker. That might all be true, but spending 15 minutes to let them talk it out and then guiding them, and maybe I didn't make the right solution. That's the other thing. I'm not always right. I might think I've come up with this brilliancy, but I'm not always right. And I tell you, 100% of the time, Amy, I'm better off just sitting back and smiling more. And maybe instead of smiling more, it might not be a pretty face at the table, but just not frowning and saying, get on with your work, but taking it all in and relaxing a little bit and letting them speak to me, and then together coming up with a conclusion. Same with kids, any conversation. Does anybody really want to be talked at? Or, and if it's simply to be told what to do, send an email and tell them what to do. Don't have a meeting or a conversation to get there where I'm just telling them uh, my thoughts. That's not a conversation.
Right. Right, right, right. So we just did board meetings and for the National Association, and I serve on the board and I'm going to be president. But there's a couple of things that came out of this last 2 days of board meetings. And I was talking to the current president the morning of the second day, because the first day we were talking about some things that I'm pretty passionate about. And so I was making sure that I was speaking up and I was
Right.
sharing ideas and thoughts, because that's part of being on a board.
Right.
Well, the role of president is you're supposed to be moderating the conversation and sharing less of your opinion, because it's
Right. More of a facilitator.
more of a facilitator. And so I texted the president in the morning, or I think I called her, I can't remember, but I was like, I've got to learn how to be quiet next year. I've got to learn how to be a facilitator, not someone speaking up. And I go, it's gonna be really hard because there are some things I'm really passionate about that the association's doing, or opportunities or whatever it is. Um, and she was like, it's really hard. So that talking less is gonna be something. I think it's really hard when you're passionate about things to sit back
Right.
and trust. What I was thinking is, I'm gonna have to trust the 10 other people in the room to have a quality conversation. And, and I'm going to have, so anyway, that talk less was resonating with me yesterday. And so I sat through the meeting yesterday and I was like, I'm going to talk less. I'm just going to see how this goes. And I'm just going to say, I think I did okay.
Did it
I was
feel
more
better?
intentional.
And sometimes you do have to speak up, Amy. That's the thing too, to be passionate about, but it's facilitating, getting to that point and then saying, okay, this is something that needs a little bit more concentration. And speaking up doesn't mean talking over people. Speaking up doesn't mean coming across as being bitchy or, and I do find we have an interesting role as females in any type of leadership position or business and board, because women tend to, either they get labeled or they come off this way, they're smiling too much and not speaking up, or they're speaking up too much and get the label of being bitchy or overbearing, where again, back to, it's a fine line, because I don't think men are judged the same way. So I think it's, because that judgment happens so quickly, we have to be a little bit more intentional in what we say and how we say it. And that doesn't sound like right. But at the end, if we want to have good communication, we have to understand the real and the barriers in front of us to get our message across with the passion that fills it. Right. And it kind of depends. Was yours a group of women?
It was a group of women.
Because
And
it's
I will say, all
different.
the conversation was very respectful on both days. You know what I mean? Like, we have to take turns. We're doing a Zoom call. We can't be talking over each other. So everybody's raising their hands. And um, I just realized at the end of day one, I was raising my hand a lot and commenting. I was like, okay, so I'm going to have to.
What a good self-awareness to go back and say, and probably if you asked other people, they probably, it bothered you probably a lot more than it bothered them. Um, but
Right. Yeah.
but it's good to have that self-awareness to say, I kind of feel like I didn't get enough input from other people, or I got to look at my role and be more of a facilitator, because they are very different roles. I get paid to be a facilitator. I get paid to be a consultant. I get paid to be a speaker. Those are three that, speaker, you are talking at and trying to engage. A consultant, I'm giving advice, and I'm facilitating getting the best out of them to come up with a solution, but it's not being a consultant. And I have to put in my head, when I have a role to fill, what role am I, especially if it's a paid position, what am I getting paid to do? Because it's really easy to blur those lines. And
Yes, completely. I'm like,
in life, you have to think about those roles too. What am I trying to accomplish? And it seems like a lot of work. I tell you too, everything we do goes back to our experiences. Sometimes you have to be the one to jump up to get ahead, because you're not asked, as often as the men or the boys in the class. Um, this really, this whole thing about how I looked at this, it really made me pause a little bit when you said, well, I looked at it this way. And I started thinking a little bit about, boy, have I ever, it didn't come to me, that whole smile more, as much until we started talking today. But I have always been the one, I never thought twice about standing up and saying what I thought or jumping in front. And I've never been shunned. I shouldn't say never, rarely. That hasn't been my experience of getting shunned for speaking up. And I know there are a lot of women that they were raised, that and some of it's generationally, but they've been raised that the women takes a secondary seat. You have to know your place. That if you speak too much, you'll come across the wrong way. Strategically, you're better off playing in the background rather than playing in the front ground as a woman. And I got to tell you, Amy, as I thought through that, a lot of it has to do with how I was raised. And part of it is just I had two brothers. I had
Right.
two brothers. And and my parents never differentiated by gender. And so, I had a seat at the table, and all the men in my life always said they told me I was going to be something. They encouraged me, my grandfather, my father, my uncles. And so I never really had that feeling that I was any different than the boys. Now, I
Right.
would tell you it probably backfired on me a little bit, because when you run with the boys a little bit, back to the blurting or putting things out there, it can be construed wrong. And that's all I knew, because that's what I did. I don't care if I was at the dinner table or talking with my brothers to my dad, we were treated the same. Um, and there's one funny story that when I was a young professional, and this is something I remember all the time, and it goes back to this. I don't know if it comes to the same conclusion, but I'll never forget it because of how I was treated. And I was reminded I was a woman in a way, and that I needed to shut up and what my place was. I was at a national conference similar to the one that you're facilitating, and I was there just as a participant, but I had gotten to know the players, the speakers, and was invited to go out to dinner with what I'd call kind of a core group, the core group of board members, speakers, and I was not even 30 years old. I was in my late 20s. I do remember I had a couple kids at the time. Two boys were born, but I was not a partner yet. So I was this young woman in the 90s, mid 90s. And when we went out to dinner, I sat at a table with one guy, and I'm going to tell you, he was an asshole. And the other guy was one of the board members and one of the leaders. He basically led the whole conference. He was the main person who had put it on. And I'm just going to call him asshole. Asshole was talking to a conference guy and was asking his advice on retaining employees. And I was sitting on the side. He was ignoring me. He was making eye contact. He was kind of annoyed that I was even at the table, but I didn't pick up on any of this at the time. I was all excited to be part of the conversation. I was telling about what we did at my firm to retain employees, and I was offering suggestions for what he was talking to the other guy. And he finally just stopped talking. He looked at me and he said, "Do you own your own company? Do you really have any experience? And you really need to stay out of this conversation." And he said it just like that. And I just was like, I had no idea what hit me. And I sat there and I was quiet. And actually, the other guy looked at me and he's like, "I'm really sorry for what he said. What you say does matter." And looked at the other guy and said, "Hey, look, this is a three-way conversation. That was really inappropriate for you to say that."
Oh my
But he
gosh.
basically told me to shut up. He told me to shut up, that I had nothing to offer. He didn't say I was a woman, but I know it was part of it. And I had nothing to offer that meant anything. And it was the first time that I really looked and saw myself as somebody that maybe should not be talking, or didn't have something important to say, or I didn't really know what I was talking about, and I needed to smile more and talk less. And it did mean a lot that the other gentleman didn't care about this guy. That when this was, he was a speaker and he was one of the big wigs, and he just said, "I'm sorry for what he said. That was inappropriate." So, but
I
it made me think about it.
that allyship of, standing with somebody who is being told to talk less, smile more, or, whatever. And yeah, I had another board member reach out to me and she was kind of asking the same thing. She was like, "Am I being too abrasive?" She's newer to the board, and
Right.
I remember I'm like, "No, you're fine. And she was fine. She was doing everything, but she was like, "I feel like I'm just," and so getting good feedback and asking the question and trying to create self-awareness is also good when you're feeling like you should be
Right.
talking less. And so having an ally, having somebody that can uh, give you honest feedback, but also support you in how you need to be supported. So anyway, that's good.
It is interesting though, too, Amy, that if that was a young man talking, their knee jerk reaction, this guy's would probably be, "Boy, what a go getter." He's really what
Right.
it go what would he if somebody was blurting out, when how often does a male get shut down for talking too much, for inserting themselves? Usually that comes across with words of, yeah, they're a go-getter. Boy, they're going to be something. Boy, they take this seriously. It's just a completely different perception. But this, we're talking about this not to complain, because I think times have changed, right? Um, we're talking
But
about it to cause positive change. And part of it is you have to acknowledge that there is some of that out there. And to know it's there, it doesn't mean it's right. And to position yourself to have the most impact and to defend people, back to, I find myself being a facilitator a lot to say, okay, wait, she had something to say over here. Somebody got cut off. I don't care if it's a man or a woman, is to go back to them and say, okay, you know, everybody time, there's somebody over here who had something to say. We cut them off. Let's hear them out. Let's have a conversation. You got to put yourself out there to facilitate, even when you're not the facilitator.
yeah. So another piece of this though is as women, sometimes we go through this evolution of gaining confidence in ourselves and our voice. So you at a young age had good confidence in your voice and your knowledge. Um, but I'm just going to use myself as an example. I probably didn't have that confidence in my 20s. And then I'm going to say in my 30s, I was knee deep in children. And
Right.
so when people were giving me information, I wasn't engaged in a lot of information. So I was just taking it and, nodding my head. And,
Right.
if somebody was talking about parenting or organizing the house, I was on it. Or a craft, I was deep into that stuff. But if
Right.
you were talking about something more, I don't want to say I was totally disengaged, but I just wasn't as engaged in like world topics. I was listening, but I wasn't like passionate about it. So anyway,
Right.
but I've had time to be more engaged now. So my opinions of what's going on in the world, I feel more confident in some of the things because I'm reading more and I'm
Oh,
just,
yeah.
I'm not as focused on, my kids aren't taking all my time. That's
Right.
basically the truth of it. So, but even that, because I was talking to a girlfriend about that, has created some conflict because the relationships I have with some people were based on me being agreeable and me being this person that didn't talk back, like didn't speak up. I would just, kind of smooth over the conversation. If I didn't like where it was going, I would shift to something different. But now that I'm a little bit more confident on my education and my awareness and all that stuff, I'm speaking up more, and that's making other people uncomfortable because they're not used to that piece of me. And I was talking to a girlfriend about that because she's going through the same thing with some of her relationships. And we were kind of brainstorming, and we're like, this is the conclusion we came up with of, we were so focused on our kids that anyway, so
Right. It can
it's
come in different times of life, and you can gain confidence later. But you were put into a stereotype of what you were going to say, what you were going to contribute. So finding your voice is also, there's got to be an acceptance there that there's something to be heard, rather than an barrier on, this isn't the way it should be. This isn't what I'm used to.
right. And there's some risk in expressing yourself. But there's if you're aligned with the right people or you have the right people around you, there's a ton of reward. But sometimes it's hard to transition from the people that you've been with a lot, friends, family, whatever that they expect you to be in this role, and now you're all of a sudden this a little bit more confident on world topics and you want to talk about it. And so, it's kind of a interesting paradox, but it's also a good journey.
Right.
I love um, I love the journey and I love the experience of it all.
So there's one thing, there's when I was doing my research back to, how we like to think about these things. And actually these two things came up randomly. They came up this morning and I'm like, oh my gosh, how timely is this? So the first thing I wanted to share is I get the Skim is a morning email I get. Are you familiar with the Skim at all?
Yes.
And I love to read the Skim in the morning because they skim the top news. If you want to dig down, you can. And they actually have a podcast too, but I like the Skim, and I've been reading that in my morning mailbox for a few years now. I bet it's been more than 5 years. But of course, they're talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and RIP, God rest her soul. If there was a woman I had a crush on, it was her.
Yeah.
She was my girl crush. My mom, my niece, and I dedicated our planks this week to Ruth. But what I loved was, which goes back to our topic, Chief Justice John Roberts called Ginsburg a rock star and said that although she had a soft voice, when she spoke, people listened. And I thought, what a good message. And we can relate it to her. Did you ever hear her yell? Did you ever hear her talk over people? Did you ever hear her criticize? She had a strong voice that was heard, but it was a
Right.
soft voice. And she, if there's anybody who understood how to be a woman in a man's world, or to be, to make sure that she was impartial, because that is supposed to be a nonpartisan role, it was her. And boy, did she not deliver on that
Right.
100%. And she did it with a soft voice and people listened. I just love that.
Right. And so to that point, that's her talking piece and the smiling. When I was noticing the same thing over the weekend, reflecting on her, the images that they're showing of her, there are very few where she's smiling. If you
That
start,
is such a good point, Amy.
right.
Right.
So this whole, it's funny that you were tying her to this, and so was
And
I.
you were on the other side tying the same.
I love that we're like two different views. But anyway, I kept looking at her images
Two different views, but the same one actually, because they cross in the end, right?
completely. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Different, not different views. I would say different
No,
directions. We're coming
different
from
direction.
different directions, but
Right.
we're merging in the middle of she was soft spoken, well spoken, but her images, she wasn't trying to smile and she was just who she was.
Do you know that in her documentary, had you ever watched her documentary or read any books about her?
Yes.
Do you
I
remember how her husband Marty was the fun loving, like she didn't know how to cook, back to, none of us are perfect. So often we think we can do everything. She was a great mom, but she was not the touchy feely. She was not the one who cooked. Marty did all that. He was the life of the party, but they were this great couple. But the kids kept a log, and it was in jest, and it was the times we made mommy smile, or with the times we made mommy laugh. And because she didn't get all the jokes, and daddy laughed all the time, but they actually kept a journal. And again, this isn't a mommy dearest thing. They adored their mother, but that was a great way to explain that their mom wasn't the smiler, the laugher, and she didn't try to be somebody she wasn't. And I always think of that log of the times we made mommy laugh, but guess what? She didn't turn around and try to fake laugh and try
Right.
to smile all the time. She didn't try to change who she was. And she never tried to be that image of the female. Think about those personas. Who's
Right.
cooking? She did it when she needed to. When he was sick, she did it. And she took care of business, but she never tried to be somebody she wasn't.
Well, and the other piece of that, Sandy, is the people around her accepted her for that. They did not try to change her. They still, they just kind of had fun with it and rolled with it, which I love that. So we need to talk a little bit about this smile more. We
Okay.
have a few more minutes.
Okay.
One of the topics that came up, we've been doing a lot of Zoom calls,
Mhm.
and um, I one of my colleagues mentioned, I don't like having Zoom video because I'm looking at myself and I have resting bitch face when she's like when I'm not talking. And so being on calls for the last 2 days and sitting there, and I've started turning off my self view. I even have it off right now. So I'm looking right at you instead of I can't see myself, which
I have
I
it on gallery, but I prefer the other because we're taping. So I put it on gallery, but I honestly prefer the other where I'm looking only at you.
right, exactly, because it just makes it so I'm not looking at myself. But this resting bitch face, I'm that's been resonating with me because I think we're a little hard on ourselves if we're not smiling, if we're not projecting this happy, this pretty, I'm happy, I'm smiling. Um, if we're not projecting that, then we don't want to be seen if we can't sit there and smile the whole time. So I will say, I think it's getting better and people are being more accepting of what's on Zoom because, um, I yesterday I was looking at these 12 people on the screen and we're all just kind of sitting there. I was like, okay, nobody is like sitting there smiling and looking and trying to project something that is not going on through their head. So anyway, what do you think about the resting bitch face? See, you're sitting there smiling and you're not talking. I like
No, because I'm sitting
I
there
don't think
thinking,
you have it.
I actually, oh, I can. I'm thinking, actually, of course, I'm thinking through, I just wrote, I'm doing a storytelling workshop on the neuroscience of the brain and telling stories. It's very fascinating.
Yeah.
And I had to write a random story. And it was about how I had a college professor who I went in and I was dismissive. I just wanted to check it off the list. I was probably a whole 19, and all of a sudden he stopped. My counselor, the head of the accounting department, and said, "You intimidate me, and you come in here and you." I obviously had a resting bitch face, and he like melted down on how, and I was just like, "Oh," and it was a good. It was a. It was the first time that I really was aware that how I felt, because I just wanted to check the box and get it done, but I had a you use the resting bitch face and it came off, and how that took me by surprise. And I try to remember that I set the tone in meetings. I use that a lot. When you're leading a meeting, you set the tone by whether you make it light. People can tell right away what kind of mood you're in. And so whether it be a smile, whether it be being distracted, there's a lot of ways to set that. So the resting bitch face made me think of that. And then about setting the tone. And it also makes me think women are laughing about it, but we're really laughing at, kind of back to smile more. We're making fun of ourselves for the perception that we aren't supposed to be. We're supposed to be smiling, and instead we're basically saying, "Okay, take it or leave it. It's my resting bitch face. So I'm not going to smile because you make me."
Right. And I think that is a lot of self-acceptance of just being like, this is who I am. And I'm, just because I'm sitting here not smiling doesn't mean I'm angry. I'm mad. It just means that I'm sitting here listening. It's all good,
And
and it's just accepting that.
And I do think it's funny, all the memes that are out there, and it's that we can find humor with it, going like, you know what, go tell somebody else to smile because this is what this is.
Right, right.
Maybe it's not, but we can laugh about it and we're just going to move on because I really don't want an assessment of my tone. But then on the other hand, it's good self awareness to know for anybody of all ages when you set the tone. You really do set the tone, and people are going to pick up on your mood,
Right.
on
Exactly.
whatever it is. And so if you want to get results out of a meeting, you want the best out of everyone, you got to present your best self and put other things aside. And that's another thing I'll tell myself, especially if I'm leading a meeting or going to be highly engaged in a meeting, is you set the tone, Sandy, you set the tone. So choose how you're going to set that tone going in. That's not fake. That's back to being real. And if there are real things distracting me, and usually I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, it's actually better now. It's usually because I have a kid who forgot his cleats for football practice that's been texting me 10 times, and I'm going into the biggest sales meeting, and then I've got the dishwasher guy can't get into the house. Those were usually the distractions that I just had to say, you know what? I'm going to deal with them in an hour. I'm not going to deal with them now, and I'm going to focus. And my whole focus is going to be on this meeting. It doesn't mean I have to smile the whole time, but I have to be open in whatever mannerism that is. And I have to let others speak, and I have to speak to them rather than talking at them. And, it's just taking a breath and setting the tone.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that knowing your role, the smile means that you're welcoming others
Right,
into the conversation.
right.
And so there is a little bit of an expectation of, depending on what your role is, that sometimes you do have to put on a smile to make people feel comfortable with being open with you.
So here's a little trick, not a trick. I just started a new project, and actually Garrett's on it too. And the gentleman who is the lead of this team and this big project we're working on through the end of the year, we have 2 weekly team meetings. And what he does at the beginning and the end of the meeting, and it sounds cheesy, but it's just a quick round robin. He said, give one word of how you're feeling right now. And what you'll find is back 5 people, quick round robin. I feel stressed. I feel energized. Here's why. I feel stressed because I've got 5 more meetings after this. I feel pressure because I'm trying to meet a deadline for tomorrow, and I really don't have time for this meeting. I feel, all kinds of things. But that sets the tone for the meeting, and you have a really good idea of what place everybody, and actually that gives you an okay to release that. Like if I'm feeling stressed, if I'm feeling happy, actually it makes me more aware that somebody else is really enthusiastic to get on some of these things, and I need to put my stress aside. And I really like that exercise, Amy, and it sounds cheesy, but when deployed correctly, when it really is a true round robin and total acceptance of where everybody's coming into this meeting, it really brings for a very effective meeting. I would do that in board settings. Right now, I'm not on any boards, which is crazy because I used to be on like 8 to 12, and then I got off of them. But it really would be a good way to start a board meeting, to just get a quick round robin on where everybody's at coming into the meeting. One word, one quick why, done.
I like that. That's great.
Because it does set the tone.
All right, let's talk about some questions here.
Right.
Um, First question, how do you tell someone to talk too much? I'm sorry. How do you tell someone that they talk too much or they talk over people without offending them?
I stink at this. Like when we are writing up or talking, as we're talking, I'm thinking of people I know that just totally out of habit. Motive is completely pure. Have you ever talked to somebody who repeats every word you say or tries to say your words before you finish them? Do you know that habit? You know that they'll literally, as you're talking, they're finishing your sentences.
I feel like that's me sometimes with you. I'm like so excited. So sorry. I am gonna
I've
apologize.
never noticed that. So just so you know, but that's the hardest one for me because I've heard other people say they were annoyed or they interrupt all the time. They totally don't mean to do it. Okay. This is the hardest one for me. People that totally don't mean to interrupt, to talk over you, to finish your sentences, and you hear other people making comments about it, or you observe that they either walk away or they ignore them. And that is so hard because when it's not intentional and it's a habit, I feel like I'm hurting their feelings. And so I don't have a good answer for that. And I don't know if I ever even have an example other than what I've done is rather than directly pulling them aside and saying them, maybe I'll take the, you know, Emma just give a few more seconds? Why don't we let her finish that thought? Like kind of coaching them through the moments and
Right.
trying to facilitate the situation rather than telling them something they do wrong for them. And Amy, I don't know if that's right. I probably facilitate the situation more than tell the person. Um,
I think that's a good point. I think it's helpful to facilitate the moment, and be an ally of the person they're talking over, or, so I think that's awesome. I was listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about feedback, and I was sharing this with you earlier about I loved this podcast. I'm going to read the book.
right.
Uh, but she was talking about giving feedback to people. And one of the things that caught my attention was when you're working with people, so if it's someone that you're working with all the time, the way to set up constructive feedback, she said that the ham sandwich doesn't work because it's very fake feeling, because you come up with here's your compliment, because you hear the compliment and you're like, all right, I'm getting ready for what's next. It's like so it doesn't really work because it feels so constrite, or whatever it is, but whatever that word is. But she said the key to having an open conversation about feedback is showing appreciation through the year. So if you're constantly showing appreciation for the good stuff, then when you need to give constructive feedback, it's better received. So you don't have to make it a sandwich because you've already built that foundation of appreciation and feedback. So that really resonated with me because as I work with my team members and when I work with anybody, my clients, anybody, I'm always trying to give feedback on what's working, what's not working, where we need to go. And so you have to have that foundation of appreciation first in the relationship.
Someone told me once, and I go back to this a lot, it's a 4-to-1 rule. You can't just keep telling people everything they do wrong. And
Yeah.
again, it can't be fake or phony, but when they do things right, you need to say that. And it's a 4-to-1 rule because otherwise they feel like they're being torn down. And so I think that's very similar to what, and I found that to be, it's a pretty easy rule, but I think about that a lot uh, of people that I'm working close with. It's like, have I been following that, or have I been just pointing out the negative?
Yeah.
And really looking for those positive things and being aware that I'm not catching them because there's a reason, they do plenty of good things, but our natural inclination is to give the negative feedback.
Right. And with our children, I think it's the same thing of, focusing on the good, because as a parent, sometimes we're trying to give feedback on what's going wrong. And
Right.
we're like, I can help you with that. let me
Let me
tell
help you with that.
you, let me help you. And we take for granted all the good stuff that they're doing. So anyway, okay, good answer. So what's the real in these situations and what's the ideal? This is kind of our question we're going to ask each podcast.
Mhm.
So I would say the real is we're not perfect. I'm just going to say that. That's our real. None of us are perfect. We don't need to expect perfection from other people either. So the real is um, accepting us for who we are. If we're talking over people, again, we're not perfect, but, and then, if we're not smiling, if we have resting bitch face, we're not perfect. It's okay. So it's some acceptance.
And I think it's
I'll
also
let you tackle
that
the ideal.
I think the real with the ideal too is like we metamorphose, we never all of a sudden, aha, I figured it out at 30. I got it right because people change. Your point about 40, your stage in life
Yeah.
changes, your seat at the table changes, your stature changes. And so the ideal is you're never going to get to an ideal state. The ideal state is finding out how to bring your best foot forward in the situation in front of you today with what you have to deal with. So when you think you're never going to have it all figured out and situations change, who knew that we're going to be dealing with Zoom calls, right? And
Right. Yeah.
how that comes across and what that looks. And actually, a pet peeve of mine is when we have a group of people, a lot of times it's with developers or outside, and they're all on audio. And, you know, it's like, okay, we're on video. You're not, we got to be all in or all out. And
Right.
I tell you, they could say they're distracted. I think that people like to multitask too. And I find it annoying. But again, that's a new, what does the table look like? That's my new table. So, how do we deal with that without me coming annoyed that they're all on audio, we're on video? But your ideal changes every day. And it's something that we have to work at in being your best person for the situation in front of you at that time. And
I
that's the reality.
I love that metamorph. Like we are constantly evolving, changing, and yes. And I'm gonna say the Zoom video, being on video, it was a requirement for a meeting one time, and that's when that resting bitch face conversation came up because uh, one of my colleagues was like, "I don't want to be on video. I have resting bitch face all the time." So it was kind of a funny little.
Right.
It's okay. We know the truth. We know who she is. So anyway, she's great. Um, okay, so our wrap question today is what is the best advice you've recently gotten? Do you want to go?
So, you want to go?
You go. I'll
Okay.
let you go first.
So it actually started with our podcast last week when we were talking about real and what's essential and, talking back about not having our ideal and how it changes with time. And oh gosh, I could give all the examples of how I did it right. And I thought, you know what? I'm really not, it resonated with me. And so that was great advice for me to do kind of a recheck. And it was in the back of my mind. And then I took been taking another webinar called Write the Dang Book from an author that I think a lot of, Jess
Okay.
Ekstrom. And one of her episodes, so she's doing a live Facebook, and one of her episodes, she brought in different authors, and they really drilled down on making the time, that the only way you're going to get the book written is by making the time. And between those two things and those advice, Amy, so your advice and her bringing it back to forefront I have blocked my entire Fridays until the end of April, and I call it Focus Friday. So all of my finance, all of my work, are Monday through Thursday, and I will work my tail off. But my Fridays, I am not going to book a meeting. I am not going to book a Zoom call. I might go to a coffee shop, but they are my Focus Fridays for not just the book, but I've got other endeavors that take my time that are, I might not be getting paid for them right now, but basically my build work. And so now the best advice I got was the push, the nudge, the 2x4 to say, schedule the time. And now I have Focus Fridays.
Nice. I love that. That's awesome. Um, I have Fun Friday, just so you know.
I like it.
I do
We
Fun
don't
Friday.
have fun after I focus to fun.
Yeah, focus to fun. I do a like that's my volunteer day. That's my I typically just do my fun stuff that day.
Love
Um,
that
okay, so
advice.
my advice or that I've received, and I don't know, I didn't receive this recently, but it's come to fruition recently is to have gratitude, find appreciation every day. Like this came back way when the gratitude journal started and you write down three things. And if you've ever done that, have you ever done the gratitude journal?
I've done something very similar. I did a happiness journal for 100 days.
Oh, see, that's good. Because what happens with a gratitude journal is you start out with big stuff and you're like, and then you're trying not to repeat yourself. So then you start noticing the little stuff to have gratitude about instead of it doesn't have to be
I
the big
love
stuff.
it.
I know. So it's kind of a fun process because you just go through what are the three things I'm grateful for. And you might say, my job, my family. But then,
I love
you
it.
know, a month into it, you might say, oh, I'm grateful for the gentleman that opened the door for me when my hands were full at the grocery store. You know, you start noticing the little stuff or whatever. So, that gratitude piece, I love that advice. And so I'm always looking for gratitude. So today I'm going to show a little gratitude today. I got some mail from Sandy. And so I'm just going to say, and this mail had a bit of a journey back and forth, but
Oh, yeah.
I just loved this note from you. It was touched my soul, and so that's one of the things I'm always thinking I need to do better at, as reaching out to people and sending cards, because I have you and I have a few other friends that send cards, and I'm just like, oh, it's just a bright spot. Anyway, so that's my gratitude. And I'm just going to say, along with it was a birthday card. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
And this right here is your birthday card.
We celebrate. It's still September. We keep on celebrating.
So I got it. I bought it on your birthday, and best intentions is still sitting here on my desk. So I will get it to you somehow.
And it is back to in the moment and gratitude. You can't always say to the guy that opened the door for you, but if I feel like this is one thing I do, it's not a gratitude journal, but a lot of times I'm walking the dog, I'm doing something, and I remember a moment.
Yeah.
Something reminds me, or maybe it is in the moment. Somebody does something, and I always try to write that note when it's top of mind, and you feel it, because back to being real, it's very authentic when it's top of mind, and you don't have to, like you don't have to send it right when something happens. It's never too late to show gratitude or share with somebody that what they did mattered. Because to me, that has such a positive effect, because it reminds them to think about people that have impacted them in the past, or yeah,
Totally.
bring it
Yeah, yeah,
forward.
yeah. One of my girlfriends, she'll send me a text that it'll just say grateful. And I'm like,
Oh,
oh,
I love that.
it's kind of a reminder of, I don't know if she's saying she's grateful for me, she's grateful. I don't know, but it's just like, it just warms my heart every time I get that text. I'm like, oh, I just love that she's feeling that in the moment, whatever is happening with her. So,
Right, right. Okay, I love it.
all right, well, that's it. We don't have much more to talk about. Talk less, smile more. I think
Uh,
we've,
can I share one quick thing?
sure.
Okay, so one quick thing, and I'm sure Amy gets this a lot. When you say you're from Omaha, the first thing people say is, "Oh, Warren Buffett" is usually one of the first things that come out. He just
Yes.
turned 90 years old, and
Yeah.
actually today, Inc. came out with an article on Warren's advice after turning age 90, and he has four things that he says if people just focused on these four things, they would have success in life. Number one was pick your friends wisely. Number
Mhm.
two is go to bed a little smarter each day. Number three is to improve your communication skills. And four is say no. But I loved how three, back to communication skills. He said the most important investment you can make in yourself is understanding your communication and coming off better, and investing in your skills, written and verbally, and being able to communicate what you have, because you're going to back. I just thought the whole thing, it's like Warren's four pieces of advice. One falls exactly in what we're talking about. So thank you,
Well, and
Warren.
that's all really good advice from Warren. I love it.
So on that note, Warren, thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Cheers with the coffee.
Cheers with the coffee and the water.
All
Thank
right. Thanks
you.
for
Have a good day.
joining us.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.